thank our birder photographers. We have 10 volunteers tonight, and now we're about ready to go. If Paul Anderson's all set, I'll mention as their time is going, if you have questions, if there's time, would invite you to unmute and ask your question about any detail of the venue where the birding is happening or the birds. Paul, are you there?
I am. Thanks, Elaine.
Go right
You
ahead.
hear me?
We can. Go right ahead and share.
Right. Let me see.
Good.
Okay. So, well,
There you go.
All right. So, back the end of February this year, my wife Diane and I took a trip down to Charleston, South Carolina, and then drove after a few days down to Savannah, Georgia. A trip we talked about for years and just didn't seem to get there. And this was our first real vacation since the pandemic. And I chose late February, early March, hoping to catch some of the winter birds. It's a big waterfowl and shorebird wintering area, and perhaps catch some of the early nesters, early northward migrants. As it turned out, they'd had unusually warm weather down there for about 2 weeks prior to our arrival, up to 20 degrees above normal in the 80s and clear up to 90. And so most of the winter birds had departed, but there were a lot of different birds to see, and it's a very historic area and some wonderful food. So I highly recommend, if anyone's interested in visiting that area. The drive from Charleston down to Savannah is only 115 miles, and the coast is just, there are dozens of state parks, public parks, wildlife areas, national wildlife refuges. It's a great place for birding and just seeing some of the natural landscape. So this is just another map that shows the area, extensive wetlands and lots of inlets. The highway to run north-south, you have to go quite a ways inland due to all the wet land and just some of these big inlets. As it turns out, on our way back, we came through Beaufort, and there were some banners in town. Beaufort was actually discovered in 1514 by the Spanish. It's the second established presence of Europeans in the US after St. Augustine in Florida. So a lot of history. Anyway, so Charleston up at the top where we started, and then our destination was Savannah. And then we flew back out of Charleston, took a day birding and driving our way back north. This is kind of the route we took. We did take one kind of major excursion on our way down to Savannah to the Bear Island Wildlife Area. And then we stayed just outside of Charleston, and there were several really nice parks along the shoreline and out on the Atlantic itself that were easy drive from where we were staying, and go out first thing in the morning and do some birding, and then go into town to do some sightseeing. And kind of the same thing with Savannah. We stayed just outside the city itself and visited a couple refuges, and it's a pretty easy area to get around. So closer map of Charleston. It's located on a peninsula between the Ashley and Cooper River, and we stayed over in Mount Pleasant. And one of the parks near our hotel was Shem Creek, where there's a really nice boardwalk where this creek comes down into the estuary. And then the other area where we spent probably a couple hours was this Pitt Street Bridge. And it had been a bridge out to Sullivan Island that goes back to colonial times, and it has since been replaced, but they left most of the causeway in place, and it's now a pedestrian area and extensive wetlands and water and a good place for birding. Our first full day headed out to Fort Sumter and took a foot ferry out there, and this was one of the pelicans on the pilings. And then we saw these birds everywhere along the coast, and then one plunge diving off of Tybee Island in Georgia, mourning dove at Patriots Point. And then this was at Shem Creek. This great egret looked like it may have caught a flounder, some type of flat fish that was fairly wide, and it was pretty comical watching it try to swallow it. It was like watching a pinball machine. It would go from one side of its neck to the other as the fish worked its way down, and the egret would give itself a shake and down it would go. We did see some waterfowl, but not many numbers, just a few ducks here and there, occasional Canada geese. And one of the groups of birds I was hoping to see was shorebirds, and these were American oyster catchers, which are fairly common on the East Coast, but we don't have them out here in the West. We've got the black oyster catcher. I don't know if these were two males and a female, but there was definitely some courtship display going on and some rivalry as to who got to be next to who. And I'm not sure how you tell male from female, but these guys, they'd fly around and land on the beach and then chatter away and go through this whole dance and then repeat the whole thing all over again. And as I was taking pictures of them flying around, this is a little bit fuzzy, but then once I was able to process the picture, I could see there were Dunlin out at the water's edge. And then up in this vegetation line, it is just full of plovers. And from what I could see, I believe these are semi-palmated. But there was actually quite a few shorebirds in here, but pretty far distance away. My first definitive least sandpiper. This is our smallest sandpiper here in the US. We do have them here on the West Coast, often within flocks of Westerns, but this was just a single bird checking out the mud. And then snowy egret with its golden slipper, and you can start to see some nuptial plumes, those really fine kind of frilly feathers. They just developed during the breeding season, and these guys were fairly common, and this was just right below the causeway. You could just about stick your head right over and look at them. And that was also shared by this tricolored heron, and this bird was so close I couldn't get more of the bird in the picture. Ospreys were nesting at the time, and these we saw most of the places that we went, and this bird was fishing in the water along the bridge, and mockingbirds were fairly common. We do get these here occasionally, but they're not typically something we see in Western Washington. And cardinals were quite common. This was out at Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, which is a really interesting site. It's a fort that dates back to the Revolutionary War, and we actually repelled the first British attempt to land at Charleston. And at the beginning of the Civil War, this is where the Union troops were stationed that ultimately moved out to Fort Sumter, but Anderson was the commander of the Union troops, and he was concerned that because Sullivan Island was accessible from the mainland, he didn't want to get cut off by Confederate troops and be captured. So they ended up at night shuttling out to Fort Sumter, which is just right across the waterway. And then on our drive down to Savannah, we took a detour out to this Bear Island Wildlife Management Area. And all of these darker green areas, most of these are wildlife areas of some type, either state or federal, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of acres. One of the birds I was really hoping to see and photograph was the wood stork, and they have been seen here at Bear Island, but they just weren't in the area while we were there. One of the only woodpeckers I saw, the red-bellied woodpecker, and it looks like it's a little bit out of focus, but it was the vegetation was a little bit ahead of schedule while we were there due to all the warm weather, and it looks like this is an apple tree starting to blossom. And alligators, lots of alligators once you got into the main water bodies. So, and there are snakes as well, so it's just best to watch where you're walking. Distant shot of some American white pelicans and then some coots in the foreground. And as probably a lot of you know, the American white pelicans don't plunge dive for fish. What they'll do is they'll get in a flock and they'll herd the fish into shallow water where then they can scoop them up with their bills. And during the breeding season, they get these horns that develop on top of the bill, and you can just see a little bit of that coming up on these guys. Lots of different turns, distant shot of Forester's tern diving towards the water. Glossy ibis, we saw both glossy and white ibis down there, fairly common. And then a turkey vulture, black vulture that had just landed on this sign and was readjusting itself. And a distant shot of a kestrel. We saw a fair number of kestrels down there, but no other falcons. And some shorebirds. We've got lesser yellowleg in the middle, flanked by a greater yellowleg on each side. And a immature white ibis. These guys are brown when they're young, and then as they mature, they turn bright white with a red bill. So then we make it down to Savannah, and one of the areas that we spent a lot of time at was Tybee Island, and also Fort Pulaski, which dates back to before the Civil War and was the site of a couple of engagements. And then on the other side of the Savannah River is the Savannah National Wildlife Refuge. Boat-tailed grackle, these were fairly common in the area. And another snowy egret that landed in the ocean. I'd never seen these birds in saltwater before, but it flew right down to the beach and started fishing right in the surf. Lots of different gulls. It's a laughing gull. I don't know if this is winter plumage. From the body plumage, it looks like it's a mature bird. Another one in flight. And then Bonaparte's gulls below, but the great blackback gulls, these guys were huge and they were fairly common. This is all out at Tybee Island. And so we're in a little bay where the river is coming in, and then just beyond that is the Atlantic Ocean. More gulls on the beach with some sanderlings, royal terns, and a flock of black skimmers. Ruddy turnstone, saw a few of these out on the beach. And again, terns, and then some willets. All the shorebirds we saw were in winter plumage, and some sanderlings, and then just a mixed flock of skimmers and gulls, terns. This just gives you some idea. These are fish crows, a little bit smaller than our American crows here, but the size of the great blackback gull coming in, the crows have gotten something to eat and the gull would like some. So we did go out on a dolphin cruise and saw some dolphins. And then these are common moorhens. This was the only area we could visit at Savannah National Wildlife Refuge. They're doing some extensive levee work down along the river. And picked up a red-tailed hawk that was also nesting in the area. And then on our way back, we stopped at this cypress wetland and rookery in the town of Port Royal. And this place was amazing. Nesting birds all over, anhinga, great egret, snowy egret. This is a municipal stormwater pond, but it is also inhabited by just dozens and dozens of wading birds. Another great egret, mature little blue heron, and then an immature little blue. They're all white as juveniles. And then a green heron fishing. This bird actually flew up to us and was so close I couldn't get it in focus, but it's fun watching it catch some fish. Formerly the green-backed heron. And black-crowned night herons were quite common in this wetland. And then mature white ibis, really pretty birds. And immature red-winged blackbird, female cardinal, and a Carolina wren, the South Carolina state bird, and that's it.
That's fabulous. You know, I know some of you may know Paul is a wetland specialist by profession, so he must have been in seventh heaven. Thanks very much, Paul.
Yep.
Joby, if you're all set, you can go ahead and bring us your riches.
Yeah, I'm sharing images tonight that were created in the greater Puget Sound area. I'm out creating images pretty much daily. These images, most of them are from the first of the year.
Joby,
forward.
excuse me, I don't think you've hit the share screen button yet.
Here we go. And just a few were created within the past year, but most have been created since January. So I hope you
Joby,
enjoy them.
Joby, try again. We're still seeing, there we go. Thank you.
Give it a shot.
We love it. Whew. Ooh,
And that's it.
fantastic. Oh my gosh. I don't know if anyone has a question. We have a lot of clapping we'd like to do, but if you
Oh.
have a question, there's a little time to pose anything for Joby. My gosh, the kestrel with the frog, that was pretty amazing.
Thank you.
Wow. Did,
Yeah.
did you, that your second kestrel had was it it looked
I think
large,
it's a
but-
big rat,
okay.
actually. Yeah,
Wow.
I think so.
Well,
Yeah,
how many different osprey pair were you following? I couldn't quite decide.
there's this pair, there's only one image. It's the 17th image with the single osprey on the branch. That was from last year.
Uh-huh.
But the rest are from just the past several weeks, maybe 3 weeks I've been
Great.
at the nest. And it's at the Duwamish Gardens Park off the Duwamish River.
Nice to know.
Yeah.
Joby hails from Des Moines. Not that he sticks around there, but that's your
Right.
home territory, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Sharon, if you're all set, we will happily peer at your gorgeous images. We're going from nearby home to more far-flung regions.
Hello, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
All right, so this is one of the quotes that I really love, it sort of describes my approach to photography, which is really being able to capture the stories of birds as different species as well as individuals. So I'm going to take you to two of my favorite spots. I moved to Kirkland, so I live near Juanita Bay and Beach Park, which many of you I'm sure have gone to, as well as I'll show some pictures of an osprey nest in Everett. So as you know, at Juanita Bay, there's plenty of raptors. The bald eagles have nests, as well as they enjoy fishing in the lake there. Red-tailed hawks, catching voles in the grass. All the usual suspects are there as well. In the marshlands, it's great habitat. So many varieties within a small area of a suburban park. So, you know, anything from shorebirds to migrating passerines to our residents like the northern flicker here. There is also this interesting leucistic sparrow that I've seen a couple years and seems to be alive still. So we watch for her. And also the soras, of course, a lot of activity along the edge of the lake, as well as rails, Virginia rails. Also, at this time of year, there's a lot of nesting. So the red-winged blackbirds have nests. They build their nests in reeds right along the path. So a lot of times you can get glimpses of them peeking through the reeds there. And when the young ones are born, they're pretty gnarly looking, but it's fun to watch them get fed, usually by their mom, but sometimes by the dad. Also, starlings are pretty abundant. They have nests in the hollows of the trees, especially along the main boardwalk, the paved boardwalk, and you can watch them being fed as well. Anna's hummingbirds are all through the park. This one's gathering some spider web, which was kind of an unusual behavior. And then, of course, feeding the chicks as well. Red-breasted sapsuckers, I love the patterns they leave on the trees. It's so interesting. It's so beautiful. But also watching them come out of their nests and blow out of their holes is kind of fun to try to catch. It's hard to, but once in a while you get lucky. And then recently on the beach side, where all the dogs and people are, I saw a killdeer and some really tiny ones. And I was pretty surprised given how vulnerable they are and how much is going on in that area. But there were two of them and they seem to be getting on okay. I have been back and have not seen them. I'm hoping they found a safer place to grow up. A lot of water birds there. There's such a huge variety in this park. It's really amazing. And most of these were taken within a year in the different seasons. Of course, our cormorants, they love the pilings there. A lot of pied-billed grebes in the lily pads, a lot of ducks with the gadwalls and the green teals. And then a lot of you may have seen that there was a mandarin duck that splashed in there April of 2021 and is still alive from what I understand. Hung out in the park for a couple years, tried to get friendly with some of the wood ducks. But it's just a beautiful bird. We call him Manny. The locals call him Manny. And I think he's been seen at Union Bay this year. I haven't seen him lately, but he seems to be expanding his territory a bit, but thriving. Green herons come to Juanita Bay. And when you see them next to a duck, it's quite amazing how small they can be. I really am interested in the interaction between species and trying to capture that in my photography. Our friends, the great blue herons, of course, beautiful creatures. And once in a while you see something. This is the only time I've ever seen this interaction between a red-winged blackbird and the heron. For some reason, they were bombarding this particular heron. It was after nesting season, so it wasn't related to nesting. And then this one actually did land on the back of the heron. But my favorite really are the wood ducks, and I could watch them for hours because there's a lot of animated behavior between them, as well as between them and other species in the bay, especially from the main boardwalk that's paved. They enjoy eating the lily pad flowers and are known for preening each other or even looking at themselves for the vain ones at least. So that is Juanita Bay. And also in one of my favorite places to go, especially now, is in Everett. There is an osprey nest. Maybe you've seen this. It's over the river in Snohomish, and it's actually sort of at eye level, which makes it a really good opportunity for viewing as well as photography. And you can view it from the shore. And I'll be happy to put the coordinates into the chat after this because it's very easy access. But this is from last year, but there is a pair, maybe the same pair, back this year on the nest. It's great activity watching them build the nest, reinforce the nest. There's lots of, I don't know, just constant, if you watch them for hours, I could watch them for hours. There's a lot of activity there. And the kinds of feats in building the nest and reinforcing it are just really incredible to watch. It's almost like they're pole vaulting here. But also the teamwork involved in their work is really incredible, I think. Just the unison in which they work. This particular stick just blew me away when I saw it coming in. I think they tried to get it incorporated into the nest, but didn't quite succeed. So I think it fell back into the water. But it's just amazing birds. These are my favorite birds. Of course, when the female is at the nest watching over the eggs and incubating them, the male brings food, usually flounders, sometimes half-eaten fish. She may not be too happy about that one. But eventually, this is like from last year, the end of June, we saw a little one emerge, and this is heavily cropped in. But it's really hard to see them because the nest is deep and the little ones are so tiny that their heads rarely pop up. But luckily we caught it right after it was born. And then a few weeks later, you can see it starting to emerge more and growing up. And in this learning from its mom, there was an eagle flying overhead. So they were calling to it, warning it away. And just the interaction between the parents and the young one is just so interesting to watch and to see the little ones start to develop. And then later in August, I think it was about mid-August, I went back and saw the juvenile, obviously much thriving and much more grown up. And on this particular day, it was interesting. It was calling a lot to the parent. It started doing these really strange gymnastics. To me, it's trying to demo, I can fly, mom, or, it's doing something to explain. I couldn't explain the behavior. It was really interesting to see. And then the parent left and it started calling and whining and getting very restless. And then I saw something I had never seen it do before, where it started to rustle its feathers. It was stretching its claw. And then it started to, what appeared to be maybe its first flight, started to launch off the nest, eventually lifting off and flying away. So if it was the first flight, it felt like such a privilege. It may have been one of its first flights, but it was still really exciting to see a young one in its early stages of leaving the nest. And then when it returned and the parent returned, it was almost as if it was really excitedly talking about its adventure to its mom, and it kept chattering away. So anyway, the nest is active. I think there's an egg. People have said that she's sitting on an egg, so hopefully you can go visit it. And that is my story of the ospreys. Are there any questions?
Bravo. That was terrific. I'm also very fond of osprey. Only one, but yeah, very carefully raised one. Thank you for, if you do share that location, there's probably a couple people that'll take a look.
I definitely will. Thanks.
Really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
And Jack, if you're ready. If you'll unmute yourself, Jack.
How does that
There you
work?
go. Unmute, and then when you're ready, go ahead and press the share screen.
So this is a birding trip I took to Cuba.
Jack, you have to push the share screen, please. Share
Screen. Does that work?
It hasn't yet, but that green button that says share screen, probably green.
Yes. So I hit the green button and here.
There you go. Perfect.
There you go. All right. This is a birding trip I took with some friends to Cuba in January of this year, and just had a great time and wanted to share. So this is where we went. We flew into Havana from Miami. And then multiple birding stops along the way up to Vinales. It's the furthest we went to the west. Then a long backtrack through Havana down to Playa Larga, which is at the apex of the Bay of Pigs. I found out why the Bay of Pigs is called the Bay of Pigs, because in the early days, buccaneers left pigs there so they could have food when they came back. And they were just left wild and then were taken for food later. Bay of Pigs was close to the Zapata Swamp, this very large wetland area that we explored along with some kind of rocky coastline along the bay. Then a long drive down to Trinidad. That was a colonial town, not so much birding, but a cultural stop up across a long causeway into Cayacoco, and then a long drive back and exited again from Havana. This is our group. So along with Randy Robinson, Jane Hadley, Steve Scher, Dan Goodman, and our guide, Michael Canizares. Just a wonderful guide. We had a wonderful time. Need to say a word about the Cuban people. This is a patriarch of a local tobacco farm, just really jovial guy, welcomed us in, took us to his house. We were sitting around drinking rum, smoking cigars, and telling stories. So many heartfelt people were thanking us for coming, because they really now depend on tourism for the meager amount of income that they get. Some of the first birds we saw were ones we're familiar with, except I didn't know that there are morphs of American kestrel. They have dark morph and light morph kestrels. This is a mated pair. And it was nice to see a nice variation from the ones we're used to here. Very soon we started to see birds that are either endemic to the Caribbean or to Cuba itself. That will be in the upper left of the image. So loggerhead kingbirds were quite common, along with gray kingbird. Like most kingbirds, they're fairly bold and easy to see. Actually in the parking lot of the airport was greater Antillean grackle, and a very flashy bird, a red-legged thrush, relative of our American robin, was pretty common. Soon we found a yellow-faced grassquitz, and then they had a staked out spot for Stygian owl. I was kind of surprised to see a lot of pine habitat. So this is obviously a pine tree, and the mated pair was nesting in the pines. Also in the pines was our first look at the great lizard cuckoo, pretty flashy bird that we would see fairly commonly. Western spindalis, that occasionally makes it to Florida, but was not that uncommon there, along with smooth-billed ani. And then we started to get a run of endemics. The Cuban green woodpecker is a Cuban endemic. We had a woodpecker triumvirate with the West Indian woodpecker and Ferdinand's flicker, which is a Cuban endemic. A pretty nice looking bird. Further on, this is at a local farm that they let us roam around on. We saw our first Cuban peewee. This is a known spot for Cuban grassquit, another Cuban endemic, and a giant kingbird. You can see the bill really is quite massive. It's about, I'd say, maybe 15–20% bigger than, say, Western or Eastern kingbirds that we have here. Also in the same farm was red-legged honey creeper, not an endemic, but just a really beautiful bird. Further on, there's a botanical garden that we got to visit. They have a staked out scaly-naped pigeon, appropriately named. You can see the scaly feathers on the back of the neck. And we got lucky with Key West quail dove. Not an easy bird to find. They're often quite shy, and we happened to catch one up in the tree. It was nice to see. When we finally arrived in Bañales, Vinales is kind of a tourist spot because it has this really dramatic geology. You get these limestone like plateaus that erupt out of the valleys that are just sprinkled around, and they're often, you know, vegetation covered in vines and trees hanging onto the side. And in the Vinales area, we got our first look at Cuban solitaire, a pretty shy bird. We were lucky to get one out in the open. Again, first look at Cuban trogon. Like most trogons, a very beautiful bird. The Cubans are very proud because the trogon has the same colors as the Cuban flag. So they feel about like the trogon like we feel about bald eagle. And then first look at my vote for one of the cutest birds on the planet, the Cuban toady. It's just this little spud of a bird with tiny tail, big eyes, big head, and again, not that uncommon. We see them in several areas. Moving on to the Zapata Swamp, you enter the swamp. These are man-made canals. So the people who live near the swamp in past years have built these canals by hand, moving mud out of the way so they can maneuver around. We get in boats and pole out for birds that you really can't see any other place. So the gray-fronted quail dove is a Cuban endemic that we found there. And specialties for the swamp include the Zapata wren and the Zapata sparrow. There's also a Zapata rail, which is almost mythical. It's kind of like ivory-billed woodpecker. I don't think anybody's seen one in about 10 years. They're trying to, our guide actually is involved in a research project to put out trail cams to see if they could catch a glimpse of one. But obviously not something that we were able to see. Nearby to Playa Larga, there's kind of a savanna area. It's kind of dry grassland with scattered trees, and found a Cuban pygmy owl, relative of our pygmy owl, looking grumpy, as they often do. Not far from where we were staying in Playa Larga, a B&B had feeders in the back of their garden with hummingbirds. And our first look at Cuban emerald was there, and one of the target birds was the bee hummingbird. So a word about bee hummingbird. This is the smallest bird in the world. They, I thought they'd be about the size of my thumb. They're about half that size. They weigh about 2 grams. That's the weight of a half teaspoon of water. So they are tiny, tiny. And the thought is that bee hummingbirds might actually be the smallest size possible for a warm-blooded animal. As you get smaller and smaller, you start to lose heat more and more. And so they might not be able to get any smaller than that. But it was nice to see these guys they seem to be doing pretty well in this area. An added bonus at this feeder area is the owner puts out a feeder for warblers. He has some nectar feeders and things like that for warblers. So in interest of time, I'll run through. This is just at arm's length. We had a lot of the East Coast warblers that normally, if you see them, they're up in a tree flitting around. These are at eye level, about 6 feet away. So we had prairie warbler, black-throated green, yellow-throated warbler, redstart, black and white warbler doing this nuthatch thing. Palm warblers actually were quite common throughout. Cape May warbler, common yellowthroat, northern water thrush, and ovenbird. So it was just, northern parula, just a kind of a cascade of warblers would come in. It's really kind of a magical time. Moving on, as we were headed towards Trinidad, there's a wooded area where we will locate both the Cuban parrot, and the Cuban parakeet, again, both endemics to Cuba. Also found mangrove warbler, a bird I chased in Florida and unsuccessfully, so it was nice to see this species. Had a staked out spot for blue-headed quail dove, another Cuban endemic. Quail doves are well named. They are taxonomically doves, but they act like quail. They're mainly terrestrial. They walk around and scratch on the floors. Nearby was Cuban bullfinch, and near Playa Larga is a known place for American flamingo. So it had good numbers of flamingos that would fly by, really spectacular birds. This is not a great egret, it's the white phase of great blue heron that we don't really see here, but for some reason are more common in the tropics. Cuban blackhawk is a split from American blackhawk, again, a Cuban endemic. Our guide had a staked out, this is a nest box with nesting barefaced owl. So we were able to stand there and just wait, and eventually this guy got curious and stuck his head out to check us out. Cuba has several endemic blackbirds. They have tawny-shouldered, red-shouldered blackbird. We also saw Cuban blackbird, which I don't have a good photo of. Red-shouldered blackbird is a split from our red-winged blackbird. The main difference is that the females, unlike our red-winged blackbirds, are all black, just like the males, but without the red epaulets on the wing. Finally arriving in Coco, we had, this is a sandwich tern, we had West Indian whistling duck right underneath where we're staying, and tops off the trip with white-cheeked pintail, Cuban gnatcatcher, orient warbler, another Cuban endemic, and the Bahama mockingbird. That's it.
Wow, magnifico. Gosh,
That's it.
what a huge array, and my gosh, I don't know who else has been to Cuba. I hope to go someday, but man, I'll just take your slideshow with me.
Yeah. One thing to mention is it's much easier to travel there than I thought. I thought it was just not possible. You do have some hoops you have to jump through. If anybody wants to contact me, I'd be happy to run through it with them. But it is,
Thanks. That's great.
It's not that hard to go.
Mr. Sweeney, Joe, you all set?
I believe I'm all set.
Thank you, Jack.
You're welcome.
Great. We almost have the right view.
I'm looking for full view. Not finding it. Oh no, I lost my.
Tell you what, let me take the screen away from a second, and maybe you'll find it now. Sometimes it's easier when that share screen is not there. If you go ahead and
I think we got it now.
okay, and then now share screen, it'll hopefully. I know. There you go. Oh, we got the same view right now. I'm sorry, we don't know your.
Not the same.
Yeah, we don't know your photo program well enough. Can you drag the side of it?
I can try. That helps somewhat.
Uh-huh. Dave. Bye, Dallas. Dave was suggesting something, but I'm not sure. I guess we don't see your controls.
Okay, I think now I've
Oh,
got,
there you go. Enter full screen.
finally, okay,
Bravo. Thank
very
you.
good. If you have not been up to Bothell to Cascadia College to see the gathering of the crows, particularly in the wintertime, I highly recommend it. If you show up around sunset, there might not be anything happening, but by half an hour later, you will feel like you're in a Hitchcock movie. There will be thousands of crows gathering from all directions. All the photos I'm sharing with you were taken in the last 12 months, most of them in the Seattle area, but not all of them. The pygmy nuthatch was at Sleeping Lady Resort in Leavenworth last August. Richmond Beach, several, including the rufous hummingbird. A hermit thrush, a most cooperative hermit thrush, showing off its reddish brown tail. Also an incredibly accommodating Hammond's flycatcher as well. Merlin are regulars at Richmond Beach, although one day a lighter colored one showed up. I believe it's part of the prairie population and is probably quite unusual to be in the Seattle area. Northern Harrier, the only one I've seen at Richmond Beach, showed up one day last fall. And a big surprise for me, 2 Western bluebirds, which I'd never seen at Richmond Beach before. Of course, one reason I enjoy that park so much is you can look at land birds and then walk a short distance to the water and enjoy some seabird watching, including Barrow's goldeneye, the females on the left, male on the right. Green heron showed up, to my surprise, right at the water's edge out in plain view, not as shy as they usually are. Many of you are aware that some brown pelicans blessed us with their presence last summer in the Puget Sound. And to give you a taste of just how big they are, if you look below the pelicans, you see a row of gulls, which are much smaller. And then the front row, those tiny birds, are necked phalaropes. So that gives you an appreciation for how doggone big the pelicans are. Richmond Beach is not the best place along the Sound for seabird watching, but it has its strengths. And one is it's a very consistent place to find black scoters. There are at least 20 in this image mixed in with some surf scoters, and they are consistently seen in good numbers at Richmond Beach every winter. And of course, if you're seabird watching, eventually you're going to be blessed with a sighting of an orca. The California sea lion that's sitting on the channel marker probably is not as excited to see the orca approaching towards it. And the only Iceland gull I've ever seen was at Richmond Beach. And that's a perfect segue because my better half, Laura, and I flew to Iceland in February for a quick 5-day vacation. This was not a birding trip per se, so I didn't take my long lens, but brought a small point and shoot and did manage to find 7 life birds, including common eider, common redshank, Eurasian oystercatcher. We visited the pond in the middle of the city, the capital city, Reykjavik. And it's a large pond, but most of it was covered by snow and ice. So all the birds were gathered together in the one small area, making it very convenient for us bird watchers. Black-headed gull is a lifer for me, and there were many of them there. I believe it's pronounced Hooper swan. It's the only swan found in Iceland. Tufted duck was very common, as was gray-lag goose. And every widgeon that we saw was a Eurasian widgeon, which makes sense since Iceland is part of Europe. Back to the Pacific Northwest, in Edmonds, on Brackett's Landing North along the beach one day last month, there was only one shorebird, but a very cooperative Western sandpiper allowed me to take some photos. At the Edmonds Marsh, camouflaged, the Wilson snipe was challenging to find and photograph. Of course, red-winged blackbirds are very common. Yellow-headed blackbirds, not so common, but I've seen a couple in the last month there at the marsh. And seen several hummingbird nests, 5 or 6 at the marsh and a couple others elsewhere. Many of you probably already know this, but if you've never seen a hummingbird nest, I suggest you don't look for the nest because they're so incredibly small, they're hard to find. Look for a female Anna's hummingbird and just watch it and keep watching it. It may lead you right to its nest. I will end with the latest addition to my yard bird list, a beautiful yellow warbler. Thanks to you, Elaine, for all your work in coordinating this.
Oh my
This
gosh,
evening
I'm
of
the
photos.
recipient. I get to see all this. For some of you who may not have joined us in the first year of COVID or so on, but Joe, you'll never top your lying on your lawn chair and birding of what went overhead. That was a great strategy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elaine.
Nancy Morrison, great to have you. Are you all set?
I am working on it. Yes, share my screen.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Perfect. Well done.
beginning.
First slide, birding by kayak.
Oops, and now it just, okay. So yeah, so when I presented last year, it was just talking about the red flanked blue tail that had shown up in my yard. And that's not my usual form of photography that I do. I really, really like to be in the kayak. I like being at eye level with the birds. I like the solitude. I like being around water. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I bought a kayak and there's no going back since. I just love being on the water. So the first thing I discovered is when you launch in Kenmore, the north end of Lake Washington, there's a concrete factory there where there's gravel barges that come in to deliver gravel to the concrete yard. And these gravel barges are very rusty. And the Western grebes would congregate around these gravel barges and fish under the gravel barge. And the reddish color that would be cast off the barges was just amazing. And back 7 or 8 years ago, there were quite a few Western grebe that showed up in the fall, like in October and November. And they were very calm around me. I could spend literally hours maneuvering my kayak and photographing these guys. But as the years have gone on, I'm finding fewer and fewer of the Western grebes there now, and they're much more skittish. So these days seem to be over where I can just casually spend hours photographing the Western grebes by these beautiful reddish gravel barges. But I became really interested in what these birds were all about. So I wanted to go to their breeding grounds. So the next thing I did was go to Idaho. There's a lake just west of Boise that has a large population of breeding Western grebes and Clark's grebes. And I wanted to see their courtship behaviors and hopefully chicks as well. So just watching these birds, how they interact is just stunningly beautiful. And so I spent an entire day out in the water. Fortunately, the wind stayed really calm because if it gets too windy, the boat starts bouncing around. But just watching these birds interact. But what I found the most interesting was the fish sharing behavior. I don't know if there's an official term for this, but these birds just finished their migration coming up from down south, and they need to fatten up. And I'm presuming this is also serving the purpose of proving that they're good providers. And these birds, this one pair spent hours doing this behavior where the one that caught the fish would have its head raised up. The receiving bird would always be in this crouched position. and they would go back and forth and who caught the fish and who delivers in the next. And they did not care that I was there. I could maneuver my kayak, make sure the sun was behind me. And it was just amazing to watch. And then the next thing I wanted to see was the chicks. And so I was planning on going back to the same lake in a month or so. And I had a contact person in Audubon in Idaho, and she had to inform me that this lake, like many of the lakes in sort of east of the Cascades, are irrigation lakes for our farm fields. And this one falls in that category. And now that with our warming climate, the lake is getting drawn down so fast that the nests end up high and dry and the nesting is not successful. So I ended up not going back to this lake to see the chicks because a very small percentage of their nests were successful. And this might explain why I'm seeing fewer and fewer of the western grebes at the north end of Lake Washington in the fall, because they're having very poor breeding success. I don't know if that's, I'm sure there are lakes around that they breed on that aren't used for irrigation, but it doesn't look good for these birds, for those that use these lakes. And so another species that I really like to follow, I like to follow the birds that are interesting for their behaviors. And the Caspian terns are just amazing to watch. They're incredible flyers. This one has a crop that's full. It's carrying a fish back to its chick. But anyone who has seen the Caspian terns knows that they scream all the time. And I have spent years photographing the terns on the Duwamish River. And there was a very active nesting colony on the Duwamish. But unfortunately, this past year, the building where they built their nests on top of this abandoned building, that has now been torn down. And as far as I know, they are not nesting on the Duwamish anymore, which is too bad, because I used to spend days and days and days out there photographing these birds. And this is the one shot I got of the one flying right toward me with his infamous scream. And I like to think of this shot as the adult teaching the juvenile how to scream, because it's such an essential part of being a Caspian tern. One of the favorite behaviors I have, though, to watch is how they drink water. So basically the birds will just fly a short distance, just a little bit above the water, and drag their beaks in the water to drink, even if they happen to have a fish in their beak. And on this particular morning, I always go out early in the morning when the winds are light and you have that beautiful golden light of sunrise. And this one was drinking, and I love watching this behavior. And also when you're on the Duwamish, you have all sorts of barges, and you can get in this case, it's a juvenile bird flying in front of a barge, and you can get, I never changed the background on my pictures. You sort of see what I got out of the camera. And so I love the background for this bird. And watching the juveniles learn how to drink was so amusing, because they're not very good at the mechanics yet, and trying to learn how to drag their beak in the water, they would crash land a lot. So it was really fun to watch. So the next species that I really like watching from a kayak is the green heron. And the juveniles in particular, and you can tell this is juvenile because of the fuzzy head. The juveniles were much more relaxed around me. The adults are much more skittish. And so when you can find, if you're out there after a nest has fledged, you can get all sorts of incredible shots. And 3 years ago now, I was kayaking and I found, for the first time ever in my life, I found a nest for green herons. So these are two mating herons. And so I knew exactly what the location of the nest was. And unfortunately, I couldn't complete the photographing of the nest from the kayak because it would have been too close to the nest. And so I found a land-based position to watch this nest. I won't include those pictures in this presentation because that was all from land. But yeah, it was my one and only time finding the nest. And I love just the fact that it was in the kayak. But after the chicks fledged from that nest, following them was so amusing. This guy was stalking a dragonfly. And they're just so much fun to watch. And again, the fuzzy head tells you absolutely that this is a juvenile. And one of the other species I also really, really like are just the marsh birds in general. And I knew something was up. It was one of my regular spots for kayaking. And every time I kayaked past this one area, I heard a grunting sound. And so if anyone's familiar with the Virginia rail, sort of those, and I knew something was up in that spot. So I went back frequently to check. And sure enough, there was a nest in that location. And I had 5 days to follow the chicks as they grew and got more and more independent. And eventually they reached the point where they could wander out on the lily pads. And it was just, I could barely hold the camera still because it was so freaking cute to watch these guys. And so the last part I'm going to go through is, this was the most difficult shoot I had for my kayak. I do kayak support for a distance swimmer. So this gal was swimming from Mukilteo up to Everett and back. So I'm there to support her in my kayak. And we were on our way back from Everett. We were going past, Boeing has a special barge that they used to bring in their supplies. So this is a massive barge with these huge ropes attaching it to the wharf. And there was a kingfisher family there. The adults were feeding the juveniles the fish as we kayaked by. And I had to go deliver the swimmer back to Mukilteo. Then I ran to my car, got my camera, came back out. And by now the winds are up, the waves are up, my boat's bouncing all over the place. I'm hitting the wharf. But this juvenile, and I thought it was a female, but I've been told that apparently it can be either a male or a female, that's the coloration of the juveniles, but I was calling it a female. She was practicing diving. By now the adults were gone, but she probably practiced diving 20 times, which was a really good thing because my boat was bouncing around so much I could barely keep it focused on her. But she would dive down, and I only got one image out of her 20 dives. I got one image as she was about to enter the water, and her eyes are closed, her beak is open after this imaginary fish that she wants to catch, because never once did she catch a fish, but she was getting that technique down. And then afterward, she would fly back up to the rope. And this is actually my favorite image from that shoot, because I love the black background of the barge and her spread wings. So that is my presentation.
Oh, that's my best rail. Well, I'm speechless. Oh, these are just so gorgeous, Nancy. Wow.
Oh, thank you.
And having tried just a little on a bouncing light kayak to take photos, my gosh, even higher kudos to you.
Well, normally I don't choose the bouncy conditions. I go early in the morning when the wind is light, the waves are light, there's no other boats on the water. But in this case, I wasn't out for a photo shoot. I was escorting this swimmer, and I was not going to pass up this opportunity to shoot the juvenile kingfishers.
Thank you for picking so many of our favorite birds and pursuing them. Wonderful, wonderful. All right, Mr. Williams, Seattle John, are you there? I don't think I've seen John.
There we go.
Hello, John. All set? And now for something entirely different.
Yeah, now for something entirely different. Let me just get my
Looks good.
okay. These are pictures from a birding trip that I made with my wife and some Swedish friends to Peru. And I've split them into three kind of general areas. One is the Lima area and those that are at that level. And I'll throw in just a few pictures. There's Lima, and I've named all of the birds here so that you can see where they are. And this was an old ruins pre-Inca time, and saw a couple birds down here. And then we one day went down to the ocean and went out in the Pacific Ocean in one of these small kind of boats. And here's some of the kinds of birds that we saw. And then we flew up to the Cusco area. Cusco's at 11,000 feet. And so here are pictures that I have taken from generally along that part of the mountain range. And of course, if you go to Peru, you also go to the see all the different kinds of ruins that are in the place. This happens to be one of my friends, Tony, who's from he's Swedish, and We also, of course, had to go and see Machu Picchu, and we took the train down and got off at this kilometer 104 and hiked our way up to look at Machu Picchu. And here's a view looking down into Machu Picchu and watch birds as we went there. Either taking pictures, or Lena, and she has a 500 millimeter lens, and my lens is just a zoom lens. It's 80 by 400. So we spent a lot of time doing stuff. And here's the types of birds that we saw on that part. Most of these birds were all live species for me. I've seen some in other places. Great horned owl obviously was not that much. Lots of hummingbirds, lots of different kinds of chat tyrants. And then the big part of the trip we did was on the Manu Road down the river, Manu River, onto the Rio do Madre Dios. And we spent about 10 days on this part of the trip with a bird guide during the whole time. The road went from, here's Cusco, and we went over a pass here at almost 13,000 feet. On the way back, we actually drove over this pass, was 15,500 feet, and saw a couple different birds up there. And then we worked our way down the road till we got down to the place where we eventually got onto a boat into the river, and then went down around it, kind of made a big round trip and looked at birds along the line. And here we are getting up into the Manu National Park at the very top. What does that say? It's like 11,900 feet. And here was our guide. And there were two other people on the trip with us. It was my old college roommate and his wife. They had never gone birding in their life, but so my wife and Tony and Lena, and here's our guide. Here's actually our driver, and here's some kind of pictures of the sort of things that we would see. I attempted to put the birds somewhat in order of the elevations at which we found them as we're working our way down the Manu Road. Lots of tanagers, quetzals, we saw a lot of, well, a fair number of cock of the rock. This one happened to be right out in the open, which was in the female over here. Let's see if I can get this to work. And we stopped at a place that's a famous luck that people go to see, which is down on the Manu Road. And if you ever look to go birding in Peru, and you'll see that there's a lek, and this one's been there for a long time, and probably you would go to this one. Seemed like there were a lot of different birders from different places that were going to this place. Weather wasn't always perfect, but for the most part, and when we eventually got down to the bottom of the Manu Road, we got onto the Manu River. So we're now down into the headwaters of the Amazon basin. And then going into the jungles and stuff, and to show that weather wasn't always perfect. We had been out in the morning, and in the afternoon we came back and got back just in time to avoid these kinds of conditions. was going to show, we went to this one place, which was interesting. It was a really tall tree, and we climbed up the 300 steps to get up to this observation place to see the jungle from the top side. It's the only time we ever did get to see, well, what does the top of the jungle actually look like? Interesting woodpeckers. Lots of hummingbirds. And from the boat, as we'd go down river, we would see a number of different species of birds that were shore oriented. That was my timer saying that my 8 minutes were up, but I'm getting close to the end here, I think. Oh, and I ended with a few unknown winged birds, winged animals. That's it.
Excellent. Boy, I think we need to have a members photo night like every third meeting, because it's just painful to limit the amount of time. But thank you very much, Jack. My gosh, in those heavy tropical climes to be able to get those photos. Terrific. And once again, for something really different, Qinglin.
Oh, hi. I'm just going to.
Ni hao ma.
my-
Yeah.
Ni hao. I'm going to share my screen. You show up?
There you go. Yes, ma'am. If you
Okay.
go to that slideshow button, if you can find it. There you go. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Today I'm just going to talk about two species, primarily their behavior. I want to see the greater and lesser prairie chicken for years. So this is the year I decided that it's a time to go before they disappear, actually. So I found a tour offered by Sheridan, who's a biologist, owns a touring company called the Reefs to Rockies, based in Denver. She has this specific special vehicle modified for her tour. The top of the vehicle can be raised, so turn it into kind of like African safari truck. So I met them in Denver. She's a driver and the guide. Only have 5 people, so it's a very small group. Drove to, I think it's called Phillipsburg. Move this thing, yeah. Phillipsburg, just across border in Kansas with Colorado. That's where we saw greater prairie chicken. Then we went to Curvin, Cheyenne Bottom, Quivery to see some water birds in those wetlands. But unfortunately, it's all dry, so nothing's there. Very, very sad. Eventually, we made to Oakley to see the lesser prairie chicken. And then on our way back, we visited the Little Jerusalem State Park for some sceneries. then returned to Denver 4 days, 3 nights. This is not a hardcore birding group, but more like nature tour. I thoroughly enjoyed. So many animals too. The greater prairie chicken used to occupy big portion of the middle of the United States and Canada, but now their territory shrunk 90% or more. So they are highly endangered. Primarily their territories are here. So we went to Kansas to see them. This is a private ranch, Sheridan Ranch, with the owner who doesn't really depend on farming for his income. So he kept this area just free, wild. It looks like this. We arrived there before dawn. It's totally dark. This is what it looks like. 8 males showed up before dawn. And this is what they look like. The greater prairie chicken before this full display has all the feathers popped up to make them look very interesting. They were dancing, stamp their feet, make interesting sound, and the vocalization, more like a booming sound. They'll rush towards each other, but before they crash, they'll stop, hold the rush, and start this staring contest. They'll display some aggression, like a samurai fight. They will kind of bow to each other and sit down on the ground for just a second or two, then start to fight. They'll jump. They have very sharp bill and sharp toes here. Look at this feather being picked, this guy. And look at this one. 2 places on his air sac nearly got pierced through. If that happened, he'll lose his great symbol of macho-ness. Suddenly, a female showed up from nowhere. Of course, when the female showed up, all the males, 8 males, the activity went up another notch. But interestingly, they don't just all run towards the female. Only the alpha male allowed to go close to her. All other males have their specific spot on the neck. They just stand there, their own spot. Only the alpha male went to try to on her. The female has a final say if she accepts this alpha male or not. So he tried his best to try to win her over. He is happy, as if he's saying this enough. The guide, local guide, the owner of the ranch, told us this is the posture of the female. Agreed to make him mount her, but that never happened. We don't know why. In a couple of days, we went to another place to see the lesser prairie chicken. It's on Nature Conservancy owns that place called Smoky Valley Ranch. It has bison also. So we arrived there before dawn, and their territory was all pink region, very, very small. The primarily in Texas. Kansas has a small portion and Colorado has a very tiny portion. The overlap region with greater, even smaller. This is what they look like. Very much look like a greater prairie chicken. They're smaller, like a 1/3 smaller, and their air sac is more like a pinkish than yellowish. Even though they are smaller, but they are much more aggressive. They'll rush more towards each other. And they fight more, much more. I like, my favorite is the ninja cake. They probably should call it, instead of a ninja cake, a chicken cake. Well, all those males look alike. This big for the little lesser prairie chicken, 20 males showed up, no female. The next start in February will last until June. Because if the female lose a clutch, she will return to the lake. So every day, those males will go to the lake until June. Hopefully, some female will show up. And the ranger then told us he could tell there were 3 hybrids between greater and lesser among those 20. I said, I couldn't tell anything. They all look alike. He says by vocalization, the hybrid does not sound like greater or lesser. Also, even among the lesser or among the greater, I couldn't tell them apart. He said, look in there, among all this excitement of the display, a coyote suddenly showed up. We all just, oh God, what's going to happen? But we were not allowed to go outside our trailer, just had to watch what's going to happen. Pretty soon, the second coyote showed up. The chickens did not just disappear and go hide. They kind of look and they stopped their display to looking at the coyote. The coyote did not chase the chickens. Instead, they're kind of sleeping on the ground, maybe for prairie dog or ground squirrel or something. Then this one stared right into the trailer. I don't know if the coyote sensed us or saw us. Then bid goodbye. But anyway, how do you tell individuals from each other by their tail pattern? Just like a whale, their dorsal fins different, their tails different, the prairie chicken. Well, how do you tell greater from lesser? Of course, greater is bigger and has yellow air sac, but to me, it's their vocalization, dancing style. It's more like a booming sound for greater, and lesser is a gobbling sound like a chicken. Of course, their distribution range is quite different, very small overlap area. So after watching all this, I probably should not eat chicken anymore. Thank you, that's it. Okay, I think I'm done.
Qinglin, I will never forget the ninja prairie chicken and his macho-ness. The other one's macho-ness. That's hilarious.
Yes, it is.
Wow. Well, next year we'll ask you to bring some audio so we can appreciate the difference.
Well, I saw that you can hear it from internet, you can get it. I don't know how to play it in the
Of course. Thank you very much. What
yeah.
one single-mindedness you've had to pursue this pair of birds. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Pat. Welle.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful to have
I'm
you.
here.
Thank you.
Great.
Another fine photographer in the world. Thank you. Whenever you're ready.
let's
Yep.
See, this should work.
Perfect.
You got that?
It's Alaska.
Okay, good. So I'm going to show photos from a recent trip I did basically a couple of weeks in early May. And I went up there for 2 reasons. One, I wanted to go to the bird festival that they have in Homer. So I spent several days down here in the Homer area, Ketchimek Bay, and I'll show some photos from that. And then also I went out to Bethel area in the Yukon Delta and up to a small native village up there where my daughter teaches. So that was an interesting, very interesting experience. But, you know, mostly birding, but a few other things involved as well. If you haven't been to the Homer Bird Festival, I would highly recommend it. It was a lot of fun, and there's a lot of different activities that they have, a lot of boat tours that you can go out on. We did both a kayaking and a water tour. But first, when we got there, right off the refuge area, there is a mudflat area. And sandhill cranes were right there. Now, I've seen sandhill cranes mostly down on Sauvie Island, as I live in Southwest Washington, but not really in the breeding colors. And there was quite a bit of this going on, and they were fairly close. They was easy to get near, but still far enough away from them. So it was fun to watch them there. But very beautiful colors. And there was some of the dancing the bills skyward. This one, there was a flock going overhead at that time, and there was a lot of calling back and forth. So it was really interesting to see that. Another group of them. So it was fun just to spend, I probably spent an hour, not too much longer. I had a presentation that I was scheduled to go to, but again, lots of different things going on. And I didn't see them back in this area again during the few days that I was there, but I did see them in another area at a further distance. So that was good. And then, as I said, oh, this was another little guy that I saw out there, the lesser yellow legs. I'm more familiar with the greater yellow legs, but I'm fairly sure with the size of the bill on this one and the little head that he had there that this was the lesser one. So they were, and I saw a few of them around, not too many, but a few. When we got out onto the water, we went out on a small, there was like 6 or 7 people on the boat. It was one of the water taxis out there. And we saw small groups of birds out there. So this will be just some of the coastal birds that we saw. The tufted puffin. We saw a few of those mostly as individuals, a couple of small groups of them, but again, mostly individual birds that were out. On the rocks there, this is, if anybody's been up in this bay, there's I think they call it Gull Island, and there were huge numbers of gulls, of course, but also this flock of what I believe are surf birds. And there were large numbers of them, the bright yellow legs, and they were pretty they were very, very busy, let's just say. They were moving around quite a bit. And then I did catch them in flight as well. So it was a lot of fun. It was a calm morning mostly, and we got to tour around the island a little bit. And then we went up to some other rocks. I'll show some more pictures of that later, but the pigeon guillemots were out. So that was kind of fun to see. Again, small groups of them, not large flocks here, but some interesting little groups of them. And then the marbled murrelets, which we get down on the coast, but they're quite a bit harder to see, I think, down here. We don't get them quite as close. And so being out on a boat and being able to see them was a lot of fun for me. So there was that and another one of the marbled murrelets. So it was really fun to be able to see these on the water like that. And the surf scotters. So we saw small groups of them as well. This is one that I had not seen before, the harlequin duck. I think you have them in Eastern Washington, possibly. I haven't seen them out here in Western Washington, but it was nice to see it up there. It's not a great photo of them. There was actually 2 of them there as we got closer to the rocks, but we weren't that close to get a really good shot of it. But they're so distinctive, so it was a fun picture to have. And I did see a redneck grebe, another one that I have not seen down here before. So that was fun to see. Common loons, we do get them on the coast, mostly during the winter. I see them here in midwinter, but they're one of my favorite birds. So it was fun and of course you only see 1 or 2 of them at a time, usually out in an area. I also saw a belted kingfisher out there on the rocks. So this was on the boat tour. The day before, we had been out in a kayak tour. I didn't have my camera with me then, but we did see one again out that day as well. So I saw a couple belted kingfishers up there that trip. It was really interesting to see out there on the rocks. And then I just like this picture, the juvenile bald eagle out there, just holding his ground there against the background. That was really fun to watch him a little bit. He eventually took off. There were lots of bald eagles all over the area, but this one was kind of just hanging out. And then I'm going to switch gears here and go up to the Yukon Delta. Completely different environment up there. Everything is water. There's just, if you've ever been up in there, it's scrubby pines, it's willows, it's beautiful moose country, but it's very, very wet. And of course, in the spring, we did have quite a bit of water, but this particular area is just flying over it. All you see is water and river and more water. So it's kind of interesting. the village where we're at has one road, well, a couple of roads, but really one main one that I walk on, and that goes out to the airport. This was a northern pintail out on one of the marshes there. And again, you can see that kind of background that is very marshy, very wet. And there were some flocks of ducks, not a great number of them, but a few on the marshes. And I like to actually photograph a lot of the passerines, and I was able to see some of those. I'll show those in a minute. But I also saw these great white-fronted goose. I believe that's what these are. I've not seen them, of course, down here, but the underbelly there was pretty prominent and visible. So there was about 4 of them flying over, maybe a few more. Not a lot, but just a couple that I got to see. This was a pine grosbeak that, walking on the road, he was not very far in front of me and just allowed me to kind of just sit back and take some good shots of him. So I was really pleased with that. And then one of my favorite birds is Savannah sparrow that we do see down here, but it's again fun to see them tucked down into the bushes, and the yellow eye patch there, of course, is prominent. So that was an interesting sight up there. I believe this is a yellow-rumped warbler. I'm not really familiar with too many warblers. Just starting to make notice of them. But again, seeing them up there tucked into the bushes as you're walking along was a lot of fun, and hearing them. And there were several others that I saw. In fact, I meant to mention on the grosbeak, I saw the females as well, but didn't get a picture of them. They're more yellow and greenish lime color. And then this, the tree swallows, was fun to see. They were flying all over the place. Talking to one of the native villagers there, she was excited because the tree swallows had just returned. And of course, this was like about 3 weeks after they returned here. So, but they were flying all over the place up there, and they were nesting and beginning to nest up there. And then lastly, I just put this one in, the robin, because in talking to the native woman, it surprised me. She just said, yeah, it's so great to have the robins back. And you had to stop and think a minute, because my robins don't migrate. Well, they do up there. So they were, just getting back up in that part of the world. So I'll end it on that.
Thank you, Pat. We get so provincial. We talk about our birds, and when they leave, well, they go up there, a lot of them, to breed. So
Yeah.
you brought us another angle of the picture.
Yeah, and it was interesting, again, talking to the villagers up there, because they see things just a little bit differently than we do, and
Sure,
at different times and all that. So it was a lot of fun.
Did you say your daughter's teaching there?
She teaches in a native village up there. She's a science teacher, and yeah, so it's a 10-mile upriver from where you can fly in, and you can get a flight sometimes too. So getting there is part of the adventure. Let's just say.
Yeah. Wow. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, we saved the best for last. Kyle. Kyle
I don't
has
know about that.
valiantly presented to us before. Thank you, Kyle.
There have been some fantastic photos, so I will try and keep up with everything we've seen this evening. All right. Take over screen here. All right, I'm going to try and make this not be a 8-minute advertisement for Belize, but man, it is a beautiful country, fantastic people, wonderful food, and of course, great birding. So I found maybe my title a little presumptuous, so I made a couple of adjustments here. So just some photos of some of the birds we saw in Belize. So this was one of my target species, the northern jacana. 20 minutes into our first day, right there on the side of the road. Really cool little bird. So check on that one in the first day. So we headed south out of Belize City once we landed, and ran across this common blackhawk. We had some debates later in our trip with one of the guides of whether this was a greater blackhawk or not, but we couldn't get any definitive ruling to overturn that since I didn't have a very good shot of the legs, apparently, which would have been an indicator of the greater Blackhawk. But we continued on the Hummingbird Highway out west towards the Guatemalan border, and came across this Rufus del Jacamar out at the Inland Blue Hole, which is a beautiful little national park they have out there. As well as these everywhere, the Morlet seed eaters. You can see these on the roadsides everywhere. They're just all over the place. And so as we get into Black Rock out there on the west side, you're greeted with hummingbirds, all sorts of hummingbirds. They'll just come whiz by your head. Some of them will attempt to land on you if you have a brightly colored shirt on. So they think you're perhaps food. But the most common we saw were these white-necked Jacobins out there enjoying to see the feed eaters they have out there at the lodge. Of course, the fruit they put out attracts all the honey creepers. I love the emerald color, this green honey creeper. It's now my background for several of my devices now. Just a beautiful little bird. And of course, the red-legged honey creeper. But you can see the fruit they put out here that attracts all these wonderful birds. Yellow-winged tanager, getting a little taste of some orange as well. And the euphonias, this was a more beautiful euphonia. They had two out there, but the yellow-throated euphonia and the one that's more of an olive color, but this beautiful striking blue and yellow. And then, of course, it attracts all of these collared aracari. These things show up every morning at about 6 a.m. like clockwork. You could set your watch to it. A big family of about 9 of them would come out. This guy sat on a branch right next to us and gave us really a great look. So, and then when all of that food has been picked over by the euphonias and honey creepers, they put it in this compost pile down by the river, and it attracts these russet-naped wood rails, which are usually, you think of rails as very reclusive, but this one just comes right out, didn't mind us being there, let us take some great fabulous looks at it. And so then we took a little afternoon walk and ran across some mannequins. This is a red-capped we saw. Just kind of peeked out of the bushes, this little thorny bush here, and gave us a really good look for a little while. And one of the 2 white-whiskered puffbirds we saw, which were another one that we wanted to see, check. Yeah, my wife is studying ornithology and had done several research papers on puffbirds, and so we were super excited to see these because we'd learned all about them already. And took a little drive out into Groman and ran across this barred antshrike. He had actually come down out of the trees with his mate, and they were chattering away, but unfortunately I hit a wrong button on my camera and lost my recording of their chattering. But it's definitely something worth looking up because it is a cool little call that they have. The Mass Titra, saw several of these. They would perch above us. They were very interested in our truck that we had. I think mostly they were looking through the sunroof at our snacks, but they were quite interesting. And the plain chacalacas. I love saying the name, but more than that, I love Merlin's description of the plain chacalaca. You should go look it up because they describe them as moving through the underbrush in small flocks with the grace of a large bulldozer. And it is absolutely true because these are some of the loudest birds I've ever encountered. I saw some in Mexico several years ago, but was never able to get this close. And so as we started heading back, one of the birds we hadn't seen was the motmot. We were kind of upset about that, but then the truck came screeching to a halt as we found Lasson's motmot, a much more quiet bird, not nearly as noisy as the chacalacha. But yeah, a beautiful bird with the blues and the greens and the oranges. Very reclusive as well, so it was great to see this. I'm very happy. Another reason you hire a guide was another bird we were looking for, the ornate hawk eagles. Our guide happened to know where their nest was. You can see one of them down here actually kind of building. They had a storm that had come through and knocked parts of the nest down, so they were both out here doing some rebuilding in the nest. And then as we head out back towards the east, run across several parrots. This is one of the white-fronted we saw as we were heading back out. And of course, grass quits everywhere. The yellow-faced grass quit here has this beautiful kind of red, yellow Xe on their face, which is really cool. We went through Spanish outlook, lots of these fork-tailed flycatchers and lots of hawks as well. It's a very interesting location out in Belize. It's a Amish Mennonite community out there. So there's a lot of agriculture that attracts a lot of various birds, but these flycatchers for sure out there. Beautiful. I love the long tail and the coloring on them. The Illuminates Mayan site got a lot of wood creepers. This northern barred just kind of came down right on top of our head. So this is not cropped or anything. My camera actually had trouble focusing on it. It was so close to us. So that was interesting for a wood creeper to be that social. And lineated woodpecker, not to be confused with the pale-billed woodpecker that they get out there as well. And you can tell the difference between one has a 3-knock and one has a 2-knock. I forget which one is which, but we certainly heard several of both out there. And this beautiful gartered trogon was the second we'd seen. She is just gorgeous. Even the females of this species are just incredibly beautiful. She, again, another kind of reclusive bird, but she hung out and let us get some good looks at her. The ringed kingfisher with that just enormous bill they have, a very large kingfisher. So very noisy as well, much like our belted kingfisher. We saw several of those as well. As we head through the Aplomato falcon, which living down in Texas and kind of on the border along there, we get them, but I had never seen one. We had to go all the way to Belize to find one. So I was extremely happy to see an Aplomato falcon. We also got a bat falcon as well, but it was on a cliff and I didn't get a great photo of it. It looks more like a dot than a falcon, but and so we made it into Orange Walk in a crooked tree. And this was a night shot we got. We heard these common paraque. So cute little squeak they have as they come up and catch bugs and then come back down to the grass. So this is probably about an 18 to 20 second exposure of my camera. I'm glad it sat still for so long that I was able to get a relatively clear look at it. But it was more or less pitch black to get this photo. And in the morning, we went on a boat trip and we're not expecting to see boat-billed heron, but my wife was ecstatic. She loves these guys. So this one, again, another one just snuck up on us, was right overhead as we went under it in the boat. And then, yeah, more northern jacana, but juxtaposed against the size of this limpkin here, very large snail eater that was competing with the snail kites that were out in the morning, capturing snails. So their morning breakfast as they were hovering overhead. This, you don't typically have to ask your guide to back up, but this bare-throated tiger heron was so close to the boat, I actually had to ask the guide if we could move back a bit because my 600mm was having difficulty capturing this. But you can see this beautiful bare throat they have, no feathers going on there, it's the name. And then the American pygmy kingfisher, not quite as large as the ringed one we saw earlier, but this was a neat little find that we had as we were coming back through from our boat trip. Started walking around and had this vermilion flycatcher land right next to me. So very common when I was living in Texas, we'd see those all the time, but this one, again, I had to take a few steps back because not shy at all. He just landed right next to me. Squirrel cuckoos, saw several of these. Another one with a very cool call. I love that spotting on the tail as well. Just a beautiful rufous color. And yeah, I'll give you one guess on how the rufous-browed pepper shrike got its name. Another guy with a very cool call, which if I had forethought, I would have played that for you. But yeah, a beautiful bird, yellow with that rufous brow. It's a gorgeous bird. And then another very noisy bird, the Yucatan jay. They move in big flocks. There were about 8 or 9 of these guys that were very interested in us. So again, probably our snacks more than us, but but a beautiful bird, a gorgeous jay. And then before we left for the airport, our last photo that I got of our yellow-throated warbler, still here in the crooked tree. So one we get kind of down here in this area sometimes, rarity, but a beautiful bird that just was hanging out with us as we're eating our lunch and heading to the airport. So, and that is all I have. So thank you, everyone.
Bravo. Oh my gosh, your 18-second night shot. That's astounding. I I think all of the participants and the people who will get to enjoy these in the future would like to give you a standing ovation. I'm afraid clapping doesn't come across very well on Zoom, but we really appreciate all this effort that you went to all. And where's my slide? Where'd it go? Well, you know who you are. There we go. This is the one. Each and every one of you, I know a little bit of how much work. Well, you're taking the photos is one thing, and then preparing them, and so many were nicely labeled. So those of us who like to read the names could benefit from that too. So thank you very, very much.